I pray that God will use today's sermon to make us more into the likeness of Jesus Christ. Don't you just love humble people? I mean, whenever you see them, wherever you run into them, they have good lives, and so shall we have fruitful lives as we are humbler. I believe that humility leads to a life that is happier, friendlier. We're more pleasant to be with when we're humble than when we're arrogant. I'm talking about the kind of people who are pleasant to be with. They multiply the love and the joy whenever you're around them. I want to be that kind of person. How about you? We profess a God whose love is greater than we can imagine, and that we receive this. We are grateful recipients of God's love, and there ought to be an overflow of this love that goes back to God as we return God's love and express our love for God. It naturally spills out on the people around us, but that doesn't happen so much if our soul has any arrogance in it. The Gospel is from Luke 18, verses 9 through 14. Jesus also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and regarded others with contempt. Two men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, was praying thus: God, I thank you that I'm not like other people, thieves, rogues, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give a tenth of all my income. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even look up to heaven, but was beating his breast and saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his home justified rather than the other. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, but all who humble themselves will be exalted. Late Friday night, I took a ride in the combine on the farm where I grew up. We were harvesting corn. I say we, my nephew was driving, I was riding along. I hope you get to try that sometimes. My brother's machine cut 6 rows of corn at once, about 4 miles per hour. The stalks disappear very quickly before your eyes as the machine strips the ears off the stalks. And then the corn cobs go into the bowels of that machine, and it so quickly breaks the kernels, thousands of them, off the ears of corn, and the harvest piles up in the bin behind the driver. How many of you have ever ridden in a combine? I hope you all get the pleasure someday. The ears of corn this year are shorter than usual due to the drought. But my brother is very happy to have a crop. He thinks he'll have about 2/3 of an average crop. Not bad for the worst drought in his lifetime. I was at the family farm near Adrian for our annual family reunion and apple butter bee. On Friday evening, 19 of us started peeling and dicing apples, and I did think of the men's club who was doing the same thing here at church Friday and Saturday to make our pies. Early Saturday morning on the farm, we started cooking the apple cider and the apples in a giant copper kettle over an open fire. About 60 people came in on Saturday morning from all over the country, and we started canning the apple butter about 4:30 in the afternoon. Because of the drought, our apples came from Ohio this year. There are good things in Ohio. And the apples were a bit smaller than average, but some say their juice is sweeter when they're smaller. Maybe the same amount of fructose gets concentrated in the smaller apple. Likewise with grapes. Perhaps in a drought, the grapes are smaller, but they're sweeter than ever. Have you ever been through a drought in your life? Has this been a hard year for you? But in spite of it, are you still bearing fruit for God? Still affecting others in the name of Jesus Christ? As followers of Jesus, when life puts a squeeze on us, we can still bear fruit for God, and there can still be a sweetness about us. Perhaps droughts can even bring out the sweetness. What a testimony it is to the grace of God when our sweetness oozes out of us in times of drought. It's because of the great love of God that has been shed abroad in our hearts, as St. Paul said, that nothing can separate us from the love of Christ. In today's gospel reading, Jesus was addressing a very specific problem, an arrogance problem, a moral superiority problem. People looking down their noses at other people. It's an uppity attitude. We get carried away with our own self-importance, or we think we're so righteous and that other people are morally inferior. The text says they, quote, trusted in themselves that they were righteous and regarded others with contempt. Be careful not to look down your nose at your neighbors sitting around you this morning. If you've ever been caught on the south end of someone's contempt, you know this is a very ugly feeling. It breeds resentment, alienation, and anger. I remember in high school sports how I felt about the fans of the opposing team. My own school colors happened to be green and white, just as I'm wearing this morning with the church year. It's the right color. But I was excited, wasn't I, when I got to suit up in my hometown colors this morning. They almost became sacred to me, superior to all other colors when I was in high school. I saw a fan bus for the other team. They were wearing some other color, cheering for Vikings or Jaguars or some other mascot, and I loathed them. I thought they were nothing like my beloved Aggies in our glorious green and whites. Here in Michigan, we have a lot of fun with our colors, our rivalry between Michigan and Michigan State. Not so much fun yesterday between Michigan and Nebraska. And even less fun knowing that our dear Detroit Tigers are down 3-0. God bless you, boys. If you still want a ticket for tonight's game, there are 3,000 tickets left. They're $174 each. The problem I'm trying to talk about in the sermon today is when we carry our tribal loyalties with an attitude of self-righteous arrogance. When we look at people who dress different, or think different, or believe different, or worship different. Jesus was addressing an attitudinal problem very directly in our gospel passage. Our problem with God, our sin, comes precisely when we're so sure we're right and we think less of other people. Luke 18:9 says, they regarded others with contempt. These are not the heroes in the story. This is the universal human problem Jesus so masterfully addresses with a parable so simple a child can get it. There were two men who both wanted to be right with God. They went up to the temple to pray. The first one looked the most religious. He knew his traditions and God's laws. He was a Jewish official, a Pharisee, an expert in the laws. He observed the requirements. He prayed and fasted. He even tithed his income. But his prayers revealed his heart of arrogance when he said, God, I thank you that I'm not like other people. You know something's wrong there, don't you? I'm not even like this tax collector over here. The hero of Jesus' story is that outcast, the despised tax collector who was thought of as a cheat, a thief, a cog in the corrupt machinery of the Roman Empire. Jesus doesn't celebrate his wickedness. Jesus celebrates his humble spirit in this parable. The man who beat his breast and would not even raise his face to heaven, but said, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. If you've come into the church today to pray, to honor God, to get right with God, here in the text is our model, the attitude that we need. Humility. Jesus said, blessed are the poor in spirit. And especially, this attitude has no contempt for the other. He's not looking down at anyone except himself. Arrogant people can't really love God, I think. Because when we're arrogant, we're too in love with ourselves to really love God. For whatever reason, sometimes any of us fall to this sin of getting so wrapped up in ourselves that we make a very small package out of life. And it tarnishes our relationships. It damages our relationship with God and with one another. Bishop Schnase, in our theme book, writes about a woman named Linda. In her early 40s, her husband passed away. She was raising 2 children by herself. She had no experience personally in the church, but one of her daughters somehow was singing with the youth choir in a church, and she went to church to support her daughter. Entering the building, she felt very self-conscious, wondering what other people were thinking when they saw her there. Did she belong? Was it all right for her to come? She felt very awkward. And when she went into the church, she didn't even know where to go. She reluctantly followed other people into the sanctuary. She opened the bulletin and began to read it, but found it difficult to understand what was going on. Until finally the youth choir sang up, and her little daughter sang beautifully, and she felt a surge of joy and pride go through her body as she saw her daughter up front. When the service ended, the mother of one of the other girls, her daughter's friend, the other mother approached Linda, and she said, I'm sorry I didn't notice you here sooner. Next time you come, let's sit together. In that moment, something washed over Linda. Those simple words touched her. Until that moment, she had never considered coming to church, let alone coming back again. In that moment, she couldn't explain God or articulate faith, but she felt attracted to God, awakened, wanting something more, sensing that she was loved and accepted. She wanted more of this. She was at the beginning of a new relationship with God, and she was spiritually hungry. And Jesus said, blessed are those who hunger and thirst, for they shall be satisfied. Are you a spiritually hungry person? Has God touched your heart and life in some way, and you'd like to find a way to respond? Worship is one of the ways that we express in return our love for God. It is not perfect, but it is a coherent practice, a deliberate collective effort to express our love for God. It's a repeated and sustained act of surrendering our lives to God's directives, God's agenda, and God's redeeming grace. In worship, we adore God and implicitly express that God is good beyond our telling. In Christian worship, we renew our connection with God and realign ourselves with God's Spirit. Our purpose as we come to worship is to glorify God, to love God, to adore God. But at the same time, God is accomplishing another purpose in us, shaping us, affecting us. Sometimes through conscious thoughts, words we hear are applied to our lives. Other times I'm convinced it's subconscious, it's spiritual, it's mystical. Through the prayers, through the singing, through the greeting of one another, through the act of worship, God is working the Spirit of Christ into us and the spirit of arrogance out of us. God is at work in us. We are humble seekers, humbly responding to God's goodness, praying that it may be reflected in us more and more. In worship we find healing and peace, love and forgiveness, belonging and purpose, and salvation.